Heartwood by Amity Gaige tells the story of a missing woman on the Appalachian Trail. But what happens in a story when you also know the perspective of that person who's missing? Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, your one-stop shop for all things audiobook. Heartwood by Amity Gaige is the recent Read with Jenna pick, and I'm usually intrigued by the books that she picks. Now, I was pretty quickly engaged in the plot, but that was aided by the fact that each character in the book has a separate narrator. Now, that's not always necessary, but it certainly makes for a much easier book to distinguish as a listener. In general, the plot is based around the story of an Appalachian Trail hiker who's quite experienced, but ends up going missing. Now, the book is billed as a mystery/thriller, and I wouldn't say it's nearly as mysterious as it is thrilling. We know exactly what's going on with Valerie Gillis, the missing hiker, because we're hearing her perspective throughout the events. So I'm not saying that the book is billed wrong, but it's just a little hard for it to be mysterious when you know what that person is up to the whole time. I would call it more of a thriller, but it wasn't a super, jump scare thriller. It was more just what was going to happen and how was it going to resolve. Another perspective is Beverly, the search warden, or the woman who is working tirelessly to find Valerie. Now, I didn't count the chapters and look at the balance between the characters, but Beverly to me reads as the most prominent character. She's the one that I walked away from the story feeling like I knew the best. We also follow Lena, a 76-year-old woman, following the story of the missing hiker as she lives in a retirement home. Lena is really just sort of a curious person who's very swept up by this missing woman and wants to know everything she can about this search. I enjoyed bouncing between the perspectives. I feel like it made the book go really quickly. In fact, every time I sat down to listen, I essentially listened to a quarter of the entire book. Now, I wouldn't say that the book is a fast-paced story, but as a read, it went really quickly. It's a little bit more of a slow burn as far as the plot is concerned, but I was able to move through the story really fast, and I think the differentiated perspectives had a lot to do with it. It always felt like it was fresh, and it felt like I was never lingering on one person for too long. Each one of the characters, Valerie, Beverly, and Lena, has a lot more going on in their lives other than just this search. In fact, you begin to learn more of their backstories and the things that they are grappling with decision-wise as you learn more about each one of them. Now, I don't want to spoil for you what's going on with each one of them, but I will simply say that I saw a strong thread about the connections between mothers and daughters in all of their conflicts, and I found that to be something that grew in interest for me as the book went on. I liked the book at the beginning, but I felt like this book was really a crescendo over time, and the more I got into it, the more I felt really invested in learning what would happen to these characters. I found myself being pulled emotionally by each one of them, whether it was the one being sought, the one doing the seeking, or one just sort of witnessing the process from afar. I really enjoyed the emotional arc that each one of them had, and I feel like it was implemented well by the many characters in the story. Here's the thing though, Gaige keeps who you're focusing on very clear. So you know at the beginning of each chapter, the name of the character is stated and you know who it's about. Now, as minor characters come in, they come in as just that. They are minor characters, but they're used in a very skillful way that helps support the main character's arc, and they don't really clutter the scene or the story. They just sort of come in and do what they need, and then they get lost. So you can focus on the three main characters that we're following. There's another character, Santo, who comes into the book with his own perspective every once in a while. He doesn't appear nearly as much as our three main women, but he kind of serves, in my opinion, as a little bit of like a comic relief, but also he sort of breaks up the seriousness, and he provides some context that you wouldn't have otherwise. He's not as big of a character, but he's definitely an important character in the story. Even though I didn't dislike his character, I found his narrator to be the least interesting to me, which was in a way okay because he was the one that appeared the least frequently. I thought this book was in a way quite sneaky because it really starts out as a story of a missing person, but as the book goes on, to me, that missing person story became quite secondary to all of the other things that were going on in the three main women's lives. And I didn't really expect that. I thought this was just going to be the story of a missing woman, and I found it was really much more than that. I feel like in a weird way, if you read and didn't like God of the Woods, this is sort of doing what that same story does, where you're following different parts of the search at the same time, except I think this one did it a whole lot better. This book did a much better job of organizing the characters, keeping things clear, having a very, very defined objective, and then not really wandering from it, which, in my opinion, God of the Woods was just sort of one long ramble that never went anywhere. I know I might not be in the majority with that, but it's not a book that I liked. I think what I'll say in retrospect was that this book for me was a little bit of a surprise. At the beginning, it's not that I found it boring, but I just kind of found myself thinking like, all right, like it's okay. What's the big fuss about this book? But as the book went on, I would say maybe like just before the midpoint of the story, I started to get really hooked into these characters and really concerned with their fate and how things were going to unravel for each one of them. I was very interested in Lena and Beverly and Valerie, and I wouldn't have expected that, but I think Amity Gaige did a great job of balancing all three and making them very, very different, but very, very interesting in unique ways. So I think this one is a great book club discussion book because there's a lot to dig into and there's a lot to talk about with each one of the three main characters, and they're not the entire story. There's more beyond them. So I really feel like if your book club is particularly full of women, this will be a great discussion. I'm not saying the guys can't talk about it too, but I think this one really gives you a lot to discuss, and I think people are going to have varying opinions, and that to me makes for a great book discussion. But remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love, so make your own opinion. But thanks for listening to mine. I hope you like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. See you next time.